I would like to make a couple of announcements so that you go from enriched and educated at the same time. On your way out, first things first, the best part is that Stetson is going to sign his book in the president's next library, which is the next room. I have always liked to say in the library next room in a house. I can do that here. Also, there are several handouts. On your way out, take a copy of this newsletter. We are very, very proud, and it has a good article on Stetson's contribution to the library. Also, because of logistical things, we received so many calls that we had to turn people away, by the way. We actually had to turn people away. So we felt that we wanted to err on the side of inviting more people rather than not. So we are going to move this event for the next 3 sessions to the library's fourth floor. There's a brochure here that says in dark green that says that the dates are available. Also, there is something similar to that which describes the program. It has Ivy Bigby's masterful copy of the photograph, and it also says what are the themes and where they are. It reinforces the locations. One thing that I'd like to amend to this is that parking is free and you do not need to get passes on Saturday morning. We have cleared for you. Life is torturous enough already by being on Saturday mornings, there are 2 things you don't have to do: shave or have to get parking permit. I have to do both. And today, let me get out of the way by introducing to you a very close friend of mine, a great tennis partner, and truly, unofficially, the historian laureate of USF, Dr. Gary Mormino.
An aging Spanish Don on his deathbed was asked by a priest if he would finally forgive his enemies. And he responded, he could not, he's killed them all. Well, Stetson Kennedy has managed to outlive most of his enemies. No mean feat when you will hear Stetson, some of the harrowing adventures he had, especially in the 1950s, dodging the Ku Klux Klan. But I'd like to think that I've been part of 2 great discoveries in Florida history. One, I came across the Coffee Cup in Ruskin. How many of you have been to the Coffee Cup in Ruskin? Coffee Cup in Ruskin. Next time maybe we'll get the Coffee Cup to cater coconut cream pie. But that's the least important. The other discovery was, it was interesting when in the 1980s, when Ann Henderson had arrived, we were planning a conference on the Florida Writers Project, the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s. It's curious, the name Stetson Kennedy appeared everywhere, and we all figured, well, you know, if this individual had written in the mid-1930s, he probably was dead. And suddenly one day, Anne came in, and it was kind of like the scene from Frankenstein. He's alive! He's alive! And I'm sure Stetson, you're as happy as anyone to have known that. But it was wonderful having known Stetson this last dozen years or so. When I ponder the myriad accomplishments of Stetson Kennedy, I'm always drawn to Stetson Kennedy in the 1930s. I just think it's such a fascinating chapter, a very depressing chapter in many ways as well in Florida. But particularly his impact with the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s. It was not an easy time to be an idealist in America. The Great Depression, strict Jim Crow line, recalcitrant Florida legislature that met every other year for 60 days. Critics thought it should have been the other way around. Every 60 years, they should meet 2 days. But Stetson is drawn into this maelstrom of the 1930s, first as a student at the University of Florida. I hope he tells his story about expropriating the shoes, I believe, from the ROTC at the University of Florida and sending them to the Republicans fighting in Spain. But after dropping out of the University of Florida, he joins the Federal Writers Project, which is one of the great chapters in American social history and modern history. In September 1935, Congress passed the WPA bill, the Works Progress Administration bill, which established 4 pioneering federal art programs, one of which was the Federal Writers Project. When criticized that the federal government was subsidizing artists, Harry Hopkins said, well, hell, artists have got to eat too. Artists are starving. And for Stetson Kennedy, I think it was his great break and our great fortune to encounter him. Decades before, historians and anthropologists discovered the people of Florida, which is a very in thing to do, is to look at the eddies and byways in Florida. Stetson Kennedy was exploring that terrain, interviewing Gandy dancers, wood riders, mule skinners, conchs in Key West, Greeks in Tarpon Springs, Czechs in Masaryk Town, juke artists in Cross City. He stumbled upon an ex-slave quarters in Miami, this enclave where I think 25 ex-slaves gathered and were living. So it was an extraordinary moment in American history. It also provided people like Stetson a great start. Artists such as Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, Studs Terkel, Zora Neale Hurston, all got their start with the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s. And this culminated with the publication in 1942 of a book everyone should read, Palmetto Country. Actually, there were two publications that should be noted here. This is Stetson's publication, Palmetto Country, compilation of interviews. But the other was the publication of the Florida Guide. And it's interesting, as I understand, Stetson wrote the foreword to the Florida Guide in the mid-1930s. Every state published a guide, and it's something you really should take with you when you travel around Florida to see what these little towns were like. But as I understand it, there's going to be a new Florida Guide published for the year 2000, and we're hoping Stetson will write that, which would be quite an accomplishment. Palmetto Country, by the way, was written under the editorship of Erskine Caldwell, with a foreword by Woody Guthrie, and a new foreword by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Not bad company. John Ford was one final comment. In 1900, Congress was when Congress built a wing to the Capitol, they decided every state could have two statues of famous citizens. Just out here, I know one person knows, but can anyone guess what two Floridians inhabit a statuary hall? Who would you think Floridians would have put up in their honor in 1900? I bet we could be here all morning. The answer is, by the way, John Gorey, the man who invented the process of air conditioning, and General Kirby Smith, a Civil War general. And the reason I mention this, I think it'd be an interesting project today. Who would we put up in Statuary Hall? School children had a role. We'd probably put a manatee, I would guess. But there'd be Stetson Kennedy would not be a bad choice. Although John Ford once said, "Who needs statues when you can be in movies?" And which leads to my final point. Many of you know that Stetson is about to sell his rights to his book, I Rode with the Klan, to Oliver Stone and Mel Gibson. So soon appearing as Stetson Kennedy will be Mel Gibson. So, and I introduce Stetson Kennedy.
So many thanks I have to hand out. First of all, of course, to President Kastler, who made possible the coming of my collection to the library here. And at the time, at that reception, she said, "Well, we expect you to come with the collection." So here I am. And Sam Fistukian, who's taking such good care of it and so involved in trying to make some kind of order out of it. There are enormous cartons full of news clippings taken all during most of the 20th century. So if anyone's looking for a project, there's a scrapbook on the 20th century over there, among other things. A good project, perhaps, for some students. It will present a picture of the century which perhaps would be found nowhere else. And Gary, I thank you for your generous introduction. Introductions by historians, there's nothing left for me to say, you know. You've already said it all in terms of what I've been up to, and I thank you for it. I suppose the first order of business, and we build this as a talk or chat or something with over breakfast, and it's going to be that. I'm just going to hop, skip, and jump around over things. And we'll spend the latter half of it, if you like, questions. And in fact, if you feel like interrupting, you can do that too, if you want to pursue something I have to say. But I thought that as a beginner, and there again, Gary has anticipated me and said a few words about the scene that we're talking about, the early 1930s. The Great Depression, in my opinion, you know, it's really with us yet. We just think it came to an end, but instead we had some hot and cold wars. And as far as I know, the Depression is still lurking beneath the surface and something to keep an eye on. We were told at the time it would be back every 20 years, and someone evidently found that wars were one way to prevent that. So that's apparently what's happened. I'm that much concerned about that prospect to feel that probably we're standing as much in the need of perestroika as anybody else, because the free market system, if you please, was flat on its face back in the early 1930s. And not only in the United States, but all over the world. And we're 16 million jobless in this country, and our Florida folks were going around calling it the root hog or die days. And that's what it was. I've always thought that the folklorists were better than us historians at this sort of thing. Phrases like that can say an awful lot. So I was there, and perhaps a few others were there during those root hog or die days. I recall another expression of that same genre. A fellow saying to me, put his arm around my shoulder and said, "Hell to be poor, ain't it?" And I thought that was well said. Anyway, the South, including Florida, was literally a hunger zone back in the 30s. It was listed in all the international studies as being one of the world hunger zones. Pellagra, the kids running around with bowed legs, were a common sight. Thank goodness that's one thing that's largely disappeared. This hunger's still out there, but it doesn't quite take the form of pellagra anymore very often. Still another commentary on the scene. There was this black preacher up in the Georgia Sea Islands, and he got up at the time and said, "Hear us, O Lord, we're down here gnawing on dry bones." And there again, I think we have a classic example of the manner in which folks can say a lot in a few words. Mrs. Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt, came south and into Florida and into our migratory camps in the Everglades, and went back to Washington saying that if you could just put shoes on the people of the South, a veritable social revolution would take place. And of course, all the Southern columnists and editors got busy and told her to mind her own business, and a large portion of the population would consider it a distinct punishment to be required to wear shoes, and so forth. But of course, it wasn't just a question of sentiment or whatever, or being close to the earth. Not wearing shoes meant that you got hookworm, because there was no inside plumbing in the rural South and rural Florida in those days. So on the way out to the outhouse, you picked up hookworm, and the incidence became, during a lifetime, the incidence in the rural Florida and the entire South, as I recall, was substantially 100%. And when you have hookworm, you don't do much of anything but have hookworm. You can't work, you can't do, it changes your life. So it was that kind of South. We like to think back then, when we thought of progress, that every time we got shoes on somebody and a book in their hand and screens on the windows and plumbing in the house and electricity, Florida was, electrification had not yet arrived. And I recall driving down the back roads, at least, and seeing after sundown the glimmer of these kerosene lamps coming on in the houses. You could barely see it at a distance through the trees and so on. So the coming of electricity was a major event, in my lifetime, and it made a difference. No question about that. I'm going to close on the scene by saying that the 1930 census we found when we got into the Writers Project, and the 30 census was the latest available at the time, was truly a revolutionary document, you might say, because of just this sort of statistic of hookworm 100%. And so it was all across the board. So much for the scene that we're talking about this morning. Gary again mentioned the fact the existence of the color line. I know that in reading Rawlings about the white Florida culture and Zora about the black Florida culture, that Marjorie's whites never lynched and Zora's blacks never got lynched. But in spite of the fact that it did happen. And this color line was very much a fact of life in that Florida and that South and that America. The folklorists, that is to say the people themselves, and I used to refer to them as ambulatory repositories, people walking around with this sort of thing in their heads. These ambulatory repositories were saying the blacks were hard put to find any medium for protest without getting killed. If it didn't rhyme and you didn't dance a jig while you were doing it, you were dead. And so they came up with things like naught's a naught, figure's a figure, all for the white man, none for the, and white folks in the college, Negroes in the field. White folks learning the knowledge, Negroes learning to steal. And it was that sort of protest was tolerated. But in any case, in terms of race, not just the South, but I would say the entire United States we were a nation of Archie Bunkers. There was no prejudice that we didn't harbor, and it was not just blacks at all. It was anything and everything that you could identify and try to put down. So hopefully we've made some progress in those respects, but that will be a subject of another chat of mine. And I want to, in terms of the context of the WPA Writers Project, that's the main subject that I want to address. The rest of the context consisted of the fact that the rural Florida in those days, the mule was the centerpiece of rural life. And the so-called dirt farmer and the family farm. And of course we don't hear much about mules anymore or about family farms as the backbone of the nation. We went so far as to say that back then. So these are things that have gone with the wind along with a lot of other things. But in addition to the mule, there was what one of our governors referred to as Florida's sacred cows. And he was referring, of course, to the fact that we had an open range back then, from all the way out of Spanish times and pioneer days. So the cattle were everywhere. And when asphalt arrived, the cattle found that the sun had warmed the asphalt, and so they would bed down on the highways at night. And at the same period, they had just invented automobiles which would do 85 miles an hour, So everyone was getting out on these highways and seeing how fast it would go, and hitting these cows and getting hamburger in the back seat. And so it was that kind of a scene. And I recall when some of the larger ranchers began to acquire blooded cattle instead of the Florida scrub cow. They used to say you could hang your hat on its hips. They began to improve their stock and didn't want it getting killed on the highway, so they started fencing their fancy cattle. Whereupon the cracker small-timer would come along with his snips and cut their fences that was interfering with the grazing of his cattle, his wild scrub cattle. So, of course, Florida, newspapers were going to press and saying this is communism, this wire cutting, which was, of course, not the last thing in the mind of these fellows cutting the wires. But anyway, that's what the press had to say about it, that it was communism, this concept of open range, common property and common grazing grounds. Still another anecdote from out of the Florida folk bag on this subject. The story goes that the Yankee tourist was down here and seeing these scrub razorback hogs, skinny, lanky hogs, and he said to the farmer, said, why don't you get you some Poland China hogs? Said, they'll fatten up 10 times quicker than these razorbacks. And the guy thought about it for a minute and he just expectorated. I think he was chewing tobacco. He said, shucks, Mr. Time don't mean a dab blame thing to them hogs. So that's where we were back then. I'm going to move on finally to how I happened to get involved into all of this. And again, Gary has told you something. The actual event which sticks out in my memory was when I was still in Lee High School in Jacksonville. I made a date with this little girl from across the tracks, so to speak. And we had no sooner pulled up into Lover's Lane and she started saying things like, I ain't done nothing but catch hell since I was hatched. And I've already done more living than you ever will. And I said to myself, I better stop what I'm doing and start taking notes. And I've been taking notes ever since. From Lee High School, my father was in the retail furniture business in Jacksonville, and he had a good many affluent customers, but also the so-called dollar down and dollar a week trade, both black and white, bought their furniture that way. And after school, I would go around trying to collect that dollar a week, black and white. And it was literally a matter of taking food out of the mouths of babes because that dollar was the evening meal. And people, his competitors were saying that George Kennedy is too good a man to be in the furniture business. He lets this sort of, and they don't pay. He should reclaim his furniture, but he doesn't do it. He lets them ride for weeks and months and sometimes years. But anyway, that was my job, and sometimes when he felt that they could pay the dollar and were holding out on him or spending it on beer, 3.2 was just coming in, he would be obliged to foreclose, so to speak, they retained the title to the furniture, and he'd just back up to the house and get it. So even if the food was cooking on the stove or a couple were in the bed, we just hauled the bed off hot and the stove off hot, and it was like that. And it was that sort of thing gave rise to, there was a little song, as I recall, if there ever was a devil born in the land, it must have been the furniture to a man. I forget the rest of it. But anyway, I was the furniture to a man and picked up a good deal of this sort of insight into folk stuff back then. We had words in our vocabulary which seem to have slipped away, not only folk stuff, but folk say. And I'll be saying a bit more about folk say. I've already said, giving you some samples, I suppose. But anyway, I was very busy taking notes before the WPA even came along. And when it finally did, let's see, let me get myself into the WPA first of all, and then tell you about the other. It happened, I was still at Gainesville, and when I went to sign up for the Writers Project, I was, I think, still a teenager. And it was necessary to take, literally take a pauper's oath. And that consisted of saying, you solemnly swear that you have no money, no job, no property, and no prospects of getting any of that stuff. So I was eminently qualified and no problem about that. And Zora Hurston came along a year later and signed the same oath, despite the fact that she had already published 2 books. And my job title and Zora's was junior interviewer, and the pay was $37.50 every 2 weeks. And I remember the first check arriving, and my bride, we went window shopping in Gainesville and said, what in the world are we going to do with all this money? And it was like that. Pork chops were 11 for a dollar. I forgot to tell you, I see a bit of folks here. When I was still a furniture man, one of the things that happened was the phone rang at the store, and I picked up the phone, and this woman's voice says, come get this bed you sold me last week. Says, I'm a married woman in a house full of children, I can't have no talking bed. And so we had to go get it. And so I made a note, of course, and still have the note. And still again, when we repossessed one family, her husband had been sent to the chain gang for some reason or no reason. And somehow in the wardrobe when we repossessed it, I found this scribbled note, a letter that had never been mailed, the wife writing to her husband on the chain gang, and it said, I forget the details, but she concluded her letter. Said, Al, said, I'm going back to Georgia to my mama, I'm taking the children with me. And then she added a P.S. says, Al, honey, I've done the best I knowed how. And that was, you know, as for a teenager, that was pretty heavy stuff. Actually, there was an interim before I joined the project. I'd been saying I invented independent studies by dropping out at the University of Florida, and packed up a trunk load of books and shipped it by water freight to Key West because it was cold in Jacksonville, and we'd looked at the map and thought Key West would be as far south as we could get hitchhiking. So a friend of mine, we shipped the books and hitchhiked to Key West. And there, the predecessor to the WPA, the FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, was already at work. And I got a job raking seaweed. On every high tide, there was seaweed on the beach, and we thought the tourists might show up someday. So we'd get out there and rake up that seaweed. So it was a job with a real future in terms of the tide every high tide every 12 hours, and so we kept busy. And there again, the workers, I made notes. This FERA worker, lunchtime came and he took out a piece of Cuban bread and sliced it, held it up to the air and the wind facing the ocean, took it down and squeezed the lime all over it, and put it together and started eating. We said, what in the world, what do you think you're doing? He said, what is that? What do you call that? He said, that's a sandwich de marisco. And it's a sea breeze sandwich. So he was catching that fishy sea breeze from that seaweed and dead fish on the beach and putting a little lime on it. And that was laughing in the teeth of adversity, I guess you might call it. Another thing we did, FERA had the notion that the future for Key West was tourism. So he said, all of you take these coconuts, gather up the coconuts that are all over the place, and plant them up and down the boulevards, the access routes into Key West. Plant these coconuts, and maybe someday it will attract tourists if we have coconuts all along the avenues. And of course, now the people who planted those coconuts, they've got more tourists than they ever wished for. And so much so that the prices have gone up and their taxes correspondingly. And they're being taxed off the rock, as they would call it, and are mostly up around Ocala and various other places today. They can't afford to live in the place where they were born and where their families are all buried. They can't afford to. So the coconuts work. So back to the WPA and the Writers Project, I had signed the Pauper's Oath, and having done that, I was handed a one-page handmade, a typed application form. And like question number 7 was, have you ever lived by the pen? So I didn't quite know what to say as a teenager, but anyway, that was one of the questions on my application blank. I don't know what the computerized youth of today would think of an application form like that, but that's what I came up against. The Writers Project, as Gary again mentioned, it was a novel concept in human history, and it was not, of course, just the writers. Who was it who said artists have to eat too? So they created what was called Federal One, Project One, for the cultural workers who are unemployed all across the country. And there was not, in addition to the writers, there was the theater and art and music. And those were the big 4 under Federal One. And I joined the Writers Project, and they moved me quite rapidly over to Jacksonville to the state office. And soon I was wearing 3 hats as director, state director for folklore collecting. I turned over all these notes I've been telling you about. I had them in hand, so I just typed them up and turned them in as my first assignment. And they were Ben Botkin was directing folklore out of Washington for the project, and the fellow who created all the treasury books, the Treasury of American Folk Song, using Writers Project materials. I think it's one of the great blessings that he did so. Anyway, he was impressed with my notes, and I was made state director for folklore and life histories, we called our oral histories, and social ethnic studies. So I was very busy. We had a staff statewide of something like 200 workers. There was a quota within the 200 for what was called the Negro unit, and there were 10 slots for Negroes in Florida, and the other 190 were for white folks. And even the 10 were cut. The first cut from Congress which came along, the Negro unit was, needless to say, the first to be cut, so it never was really at full strength of 10, more like 4 to 6. But some very excellent writers were there. They were housed apart from all the rest of us in a soup kitchen in the Black Ghetto, if you please, in Jacksonville. And we never saw them, and they never saw us, the state staff. They sent a delivery boy to pick up their checks every 2 weeks, and that's as close as we got. But they had some splendid writers, college graduates, PhDs even, and turned out some beautiful copy. And so the white state staff was hard put improving upon this copy, no matter how hard they tried. And needless to say, Jim Crow was looking over the shoulders of, as editor-in-chief, you might say, of both white and black writers in terms of what we were writing on that subject. And back then, it was still the vogue to so-called Negro dialect, to do everything in dis, dat, dees, dem, does, Uncle Remus style English. But writers like Richard Wright and Zora Neale Hurston were already beginning to realize that this was a major put-down by white folks, and that it was time to stop writing that way, both white and black. I remember sending some of my writing to Richard Wright when he was in Chicago and asking him if my dialect was all right, you know. But that's again, that's where we were. But they stopped the writing that way, and eventually now we're down to the problem of Ebonics as a language of instruction and other such things, which reminds me of kids came home from school in St. Johns County Elementary School, first day of school. Said the first thing the teacher said was, I don't want to hear any of y'all talking like that. Here come the police with the siren carrying the secretary from the library. And said, I don't want to hear it, but then she lapsed right into it, back into it herself, and it went on from there. So we've got not only Ebonics to consider, but that sort of white Florida traditional language, which, in my opinion, I had the novel experience of when I was traveling in Armenia as a journalist in Soviet Armenia. These Armenian writers grabbed me and said, can't you do something about, they thought Americans could do anything. But can't you do something? They won't let us write in our own dialects. And I don't know what I was supposed to do, but, whatever it was, I didn't do it, but I was still intrigued by that situation, and hopefully they are now writing in their own dialects. Let me see, where are we? The concept of Federal One, all of the arts projects was, again, as Gary intimated, very much people-oriented. And the big idea was to create art in all of these fields that was accessible to people, plain, working, unemployed people. And not only accessible, but understandable and meaningful. And that meant getting the symphony orchestras out of the symphony halls and into the parks and playgrounds. And it meant getting art onto the walls of post offices and such places where people were. I recall when FERA, again, was really far out in these matters, one of the first things they did was to send for some really prominent, not unemployed artists, but established artists, and got them into Key West. I don't think we had air service, but they arrived rapidly. And proceeded to put murals in bar rooms, and juke joints, prostitution houses. There was one called the Square Roof. They went in there and did murals on inside the Square Roof. And so we had a spectacle, a rare spectacle, I dare say, of the federal government adorning the houses of prostitution and the bars and so on. And again, it reminds me, I warned you I was going to hop, skip, and jump. Woody Guthrie, who was a close friend of mine and spent a lot of time with me in Florida, one of his sayings was to the effect that says, if you want to write about a whorehouse, you got to go in one. So I had already in Lee High School taken myself aside, and I cite Woody because it had a bearing on a resolve of mine in high school to, first of all, get out of the University of Florida because I thought it wasn't attuned to things like the Spanish Civil War and so on, and wasn't really too aware of what was happening in the world, and that the world was in grave, that World War II was imminent if somebody didn't do something. But I said to myself then that I was going to bow out of that and try a three-pronged experience of living life, experiencing life, and studying and writing. So that, to that extent, what Woody said was apropos of my own resolve, arrived at independently. The people who were philosophically opposed to the WPA cultural projects and to the WPA as a whole, and if anyone has an interest in the material accomplishments of the construction programs of the WPA in terms of building community houses and clinics and all sorts of material improvements, including roads, the statistics are really astounding in spite of all the propaganda to the contrary. So that there was a major capital investment in the capital plant of America was modified for the better. But as far as the Writers Project is concerned, the editorials we're reading said these people have all been hired to look into such things as why dogs bark. And they're referring to the folklore. These people are going out there trying to pick up the stories about why dogs bark and so forth. So in addition to the stories about the other workers leaning on their shovels all day, we were accused of doing that sort of thing. In truth, we were some 200 strong, very excitedly engaged in what I've often called a treasure hunt. hunt for buried treasure, unknown facts about Florida. And we concentrated almost exclusively on primary sources. Very seldom did any of us go into the stacks to look for things. We were out in the field talking to people, talking to pioneer residents. There was a great tendency on the part of some of the interviewers to go again to interview a prostitute or a cowhand or a juke joint operator or a voodoo doctor. Voodoo doctors were especially popular subjects. There's one called Dr. Buzzard and another one called the Frizzly Rooster. Here in Tampa, you had someone living on the outskirts named Mama Duck. She was an ex-slave. We asked her about slave days. She said, well, I done prayed and got all the malice out of my soul. And I ain't gonna tell no lies for 'em or on 'em. And that was Mama Duck. And as a definition again of objectivity, I would commend it to you. I'm not gonna tell no lies for 'em or on 'em. And another Tampa folk character was known as Old Pete. He was in the Tampa shipyard docks. Had performed feats of physical prowess, like a breakaway freight train was rolling toward the end of the track, and so he just got out on the tracks and braced himself and stopped it, you know, and full of stories like that. So these things are to be found in the library. The WPA manuscripts are they still in the library? So all this field copy I'm telling you about, collected by these people, is in your library, and I can clue you in this may be secret information. If you find a FEC typed up in the upper right-hand corner, that stands for Field Edited Copy, which means that someone in the Tampa office or the Miami office has reworked whatever the field worker turned in. So the actual original field copy has no such label, but as soon as an editor in one of the district offices fixed it up, so to speak, in their own opinion, it bore the label of FEC, Field Edited Copy. And then there was a seventh category you will find, SEC, standing for State Edited Copy, where we would take the copy edited in Tampa and Miami and in Jacksonville, further refine it, if you like. But of course, in my opinion, the real material was in the original field notes. And I was constantly, as director of folklore, urging these people in the field, including myself, to write it down, not write it up. And they had no copy recording machines. They had to rely upon memory. And I would urge them to dash off immediately to some coffee shop or something after the interview. If not during the interview, then to go as soon as possible and make their notes. And by all means, not to send in the original material, which was almost invariably far superior to after the district offices had played around with it. They were trying, the editors were saying, well, this will make a good story, and they would sit down and fictionalize and play around with it. So that's the way it worked. The field workers I've been talking about were, for the most part, female and from rural backgrounds, and no training whatever in any sort of composition or written. High school graduates, if that. But they were hired from the point of view of interest in the material. I was urging upon them that in almost any community or neighborhood you would find one of these ambulatory repositories who had taken it upon themselves to simply absorb everything of that nature and commit it to memory in the very venerable tradition of oral culture, which certainly lasted for eons longer than this thing we've got going now, the printed word and the media. So these were living people who were still living in the oral culture, and fabulous memories. And if they were illiterate, they were nonetheless highly articulate. And all of this came out in what was collected. And these field workers of ours were qualified, first of all, by their interest, and secondly, by the fact that when they knocked on any door, there was instant rapport. It wasn't a matter of relating the way we academicians send out professionals to knock on doors. These women were already related by culture and interest and possibly even by blood. And the language was just right, everything was just right. So the rapport was there. No problem about anybody relating to anybody. They were all related. And that's the way it worked. Someone was observing that never before in American history had any such thing taken place, and I would submit that probably, sad to say, that it probably never will happen again, that any culture or society, a nation of people would take it upon itself to designate people to go out and interview one another and write down and try to get a picture of just where the nation, the society was, what condition it was in, what people were thinking and feeling, what their hopes were and what their despairs were. So that this was a unique social experience for America, and I can't help but feel that it was something which should not be allowed to vanish forever, that it should be done again and at frequent intervals, if not constantly, stock taking, if you please. The whole country, by virtue of the Depression, everyone knew there was something seriously wrong, and the question was, what's wrong and how to fix it. So that was the justification, and our instructions were to hold up a mirror to America. The American Guide series was to hold up a mirror to America. And of course, for us in Florida, that meant holding up a mirror to Florida. And there were those of us on the editorial staff who said, well, warts and all, or we're just going to have bathing beauties and palm trees to attract tourists, or are we going to have the whole works, the lynchings and the Joseph Shoemakers and things like that. And so that was a constant, daily, ongoing battle, which lasted from the first day until the last, as to just what belonged in the guides. The same thing that was happening in the other cultural projects. I recall recently I was talking to Ivy and I were at a photo fusion symposium over in Delray last week, and any number of Pulitzer Prize, multiple Pulitzer Prize winning photographers there doing workshops, including some from the old survivors from the Farm Security Administration. I suppose some of you are familiar with names like Rothstein and so on, and these really graphic photographs of labeled Farm Security, FSA. And we recently met, I think thanks to some of Ann Henderson's money, anyway, we had a meeting of survivors in the Library of Congress. And Alan Lomax and other people were there, and including Farm Security photographers. And Jack Delano is now retired in Puerto Rico. And he was telling us how, when he was first hired, Roy Stryker was director of the Farm Security photographers. So Delano goes into he had a jalopy, and he and his young wife, and told to go out to start across America. And start. He said, well, what do you want us to photograph? And Stryker said, everything. So that's how the Farm Security, tens of thousands of these things in the National Archives, and a photograph of America, if you please. And we were trying to do the same thing in the written word here in Florida. I think perhaps I'll sign off there, and if you would like a break, is that agreeable? And I might have a few additional words in the following session, and we could then get into questions and have that chat that we will build. I look forward to talking with you about these things, pursuing certain things.